state by state. I got to say, if CB is in a blue state with a Democratic governor who is focused.
I'm going to go ahead and get rolling here. We just had a big spike in our attendance about 30 seconds to a minute ago, so that'll give me a good idea that it's about time to get started. Let me go ahead and bring my screen share up. Maybe. There we go. Okay. I am completely in the wrong place here. Let me go back to the beginning. There we go. All right. So I hope everybody is having a good Mother's Day. I just wanted to, I'm going to make tonight's fairly short because I do want to go spend some time with my wife as well. And I still haven't called my mom today. Might be in trouble. So, just wanted to go over a couple more subjects. We'll have a short Q&A at the end. So just remember, if you want to jump into the Q&A, you can use the Q&A icon at the bottom of the video pane and type a question in there and submit it. Or you can also use the raise your hand button, which is also at the bottom of the video pane. Or if you go to the attendance, the participants panel, there should be a raise your hand button in there as well where you guys can raise your hand. And if you do that, if you raise your hand, then I'll go on the panel and bring you in, and we can have a conversation. We can chat back and forth. So sometimes the questions that you guys ask are a little easier to do that rather than read them off of a Q&A, just so we can get a little bit more thorough. But that's the Q&A part of this at the end. Just remember how to do that if you haven't been into any of these before. Let's go ahead and talk about the first Sunday we did this 2 weeks ago. We talked about philosophy. If you weren't able to make those, we talked about philosophy, simplifying the information and not simplifying the action, and how simplifying the information can allow a player to move further up the efficiency scale, and simplifying the action can sometimes cause them to slow down the action or stiffen up or tense up in the action and kind of separate different motions from one another, and that causes them to move down the efficiency scale. We also looked at cause and effect and talked about, if you're addressing the effects during a player's shot, if you see a flaw and that flaw is an effect and not a cause of the flaw, and you address that flaw, if it's an effect, it's really not going to change a whole lot in their shot. It might not change anything in their shot. You won't see much improvement. But if you address the cause, that's when the shot is going to get so much more efficient and so much more effective for the player. And you'll know when you hit the cause, because all of a sudden that player will start to see good results, as well as some of the feedback that I've heard from players that I work specifically with is, it'll be nothing for a player to turn around and say, if they're giving you good feedback, to turn around and tell you like, hey, this feels a lot easier for me to shoot. I feel like, I'm not putting as much effort into shooting this ball as I was before, and it feels like it's just easier and more fluid and more smooth for me to shoot this basketball. So that's how you're addressing the cause and not the effect. Last Sunday we talked about speed versus strength, which was our third mistake that we could make, and just how much more important speed is in our shooting technique rather than strength. Strength is a linear growth number. So when you increase your strength, or when you address the strength issues in a player's shot, you're not going to see a whole lot of improvement. It's going to be very small and very gradual improvement. But if you address the speed issues within a shot, we see in the equation for physics that makes up power, you see speed or velocity come up 3 different times. And it's in both the form of actual speed and velocity, and it's also in the form of acceleration. So we have 3 instances there of speed in a player's shot. So you're cubing speed. You're timesing speed by itself for acceleration. So you have speed squared for acceleration, and then you're also taking that force that you get and you're multiplying it times the velocity, which is just straight speed, and that gives you your power, which is what you need as a final result to shoot the basketball. Then we talked about last week. I didn't spend a whole lot of time on it, but I gave you kind of the overview of it. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. And I explained I'm not talking about like waiting on results as a marathon, not a sprint. I'm talking about from a coaching standpoint, or from a player's improvement standpoint, or from a parent's standpoint. If you're shooting with your child, or you're out shooting with a buddy, or you're out coaching one of your players, you have to be careful in that you don't give them too much feedback. You don't overcoach them, or you don't give them feedback in a sense that they can't process everything. And that's when you start to see frustration from the player. You start to see them degressing. They're moving backwards, and they're actually getting worse because their brain is trying to process information and is trying to grab feedback from the shots that they just took and figure out, what's going on here, what changes do I need to make. They're trying to figure out a lot of different things, especially if we're tweaking things or changing things. And so we've got to be careful that we don't push the feedback or the information too much, where they're getting too much feedback and it's causing frustrations. It's causing them to think too much. It's causing them, to try and concentrate on way too many things, because that directly affects a player's speed during their shot when they're trying to think about or focus on all these different aspects of the shot. I've talked about, you gotta think about shooting before you shoot and after you shoot, and that's your time to mentally focus on what you're doing. While you shoot, you shouldn't be thinking about anything. You should have like one word or one phrase that goes through your mind that you repeat right before you take the shot, just to clear your mind of everything else. But you shouldn't be thinking when you shoot, because that slows you down. Occasionally in practice, if you go through a mental practice or some kind of warm up or something like that, you can think while you shoot, especially if you're in close and you're just checking on something. But when we shoot mid-range to 3-point range shots, we don't want to think. We just want it to be a reaction. We want it to be a reflex, if you will, and not a thought process. Thought processes happen before and after. So let's get into our 2 subjects we're going to talk about this week. And the 2 subjects we're going to talk about this week is, number 1, it's not about the drill. And you'll see what I mean by this when we get into it. And the second thing we're going to talk about is confidence is a result. It's not the process. And this came about because I have these 2 specifically came about because I would get a lot of questions in my camps and clinics about, what kind of drills do you do to teach these things? And I would kind of just have a blank stare at the people who would ask that, because I'm sitting here going, what do you mean what drills teach? These drills don't teach. The drills are just for conditioning. So we'll get into that. And confidence, another question that came up was, I have players who, don't have a lot of confidence. And the one thing you got to look at with confidence is it an anxiety issue? Which we've actually had a question about. I think it was the first week we had a question about one of the attendees' sons having a problem in games, and they just can't transfer results over to a game, and talking about, they think he's nervous, or they think he's got some kind of anxiety issue, and that a lot of that can be addressed by sports psychologists. I don't have a whole lot of expertise in that type of field yet. I haven't researched it a whole lot. I haven't studied it a whole lot. But I have heard of cases where you have players that have anxiety issues, and they're just so nervous when they go out there that there's all this stuff going through their head. And that kind of goes along the lines of of what I was talking about earlier with feedback. A lot of kids get nervous because they go out on the floor and they're hearing the crowd, they're hearing their coach, they're hearing their teammates, and they don't know how to handle all that feedback, or you may even want to call it interference. I brought Mike Little in on our first week, and we had a chat, and he was talking about a book called "You Already Know How to Be Great," and it's by Alan Fine, and a lot of it centers around the subject that we talked about that first week, about it being about simplifying the information, not simplifying the action. And Alan Fine talks about that a lot in his book. I'm reading it right now. He talks about, some people just, they need help, or they need direction in how to shut out all that outside noise, all that interference, the things that their brain may be trying to process that aren't going to allow them to perform well, or that aren't going to allow them to focus on what they need to focus on. So we're going to touch in that in a subject of confidence, and how confidence can be affected, and why. I have an example for you from a guy that I actually admired as a player, Dennis Scott, and we had an interview that was done with him several years ago, and he said that the most important thing a player can have in their shot, or most important thing a player can do for their shot, is to have confidence. And I'm sitting here going, wait a minute. Confidence is a result. Confidence is not just something you develop. It's a result of the player getting better and better at the process and seeing the correct results. So we'll talk about that more in depth. So these are our two subjects for this Sunday. I'm going to try to go through this and keep it as short as possible so you guys can get back to whatever your festivities are on Mother's Day. But drills, I'm talking about drills, and I always try to emphasize this to coaches, especially when they ask the question. We get it from players, we get it from parents, we get it from coaches all the time. They say, what drills can I do? Or what drills do you use to teach this? Or what drills do I need to work on in order to get this down? And I can't count how many times I'm asked about those drills and what ones will help a player get better technique. And I just, the thing that goes through my head is that drills do not teach. You need to teach. The player needs to be taught first. They need to understand the concepts first. If they don't understand the concepts, you have to continue to teach them and explain to them in different ways what it is you're trying to get them to understand. Because if they don't understand it, no drill is going to help. No drill is going to help them be able to do this. So drills do not teach, they condition. All right? So the player needs to understand it first. And, the question, what are some drills I can use to get my players to use the sway correctly? This is an example. And I want to answer it in two ways. Number one, there aren't any drills that I can teach your player to use the sway correctly. There is information that I can give them to help them use the sway correctly, or to be able to execute the sway correctly. But it's not from a drill. It's from them actually understanding the concept and knowing what it should feel like, what it should look like, and just, they need to understand that the drill is not going to allow them, what drill they're doing is not going to allow them to sway properly. And the other answer I would have for them is, once they do understand it, then we have to understand any drill can be used to get the player to use something correctly. There are drills that can help. There are drills that can focus on a certain area, but unless you teach them, or unless they know what it is they're supposed to be doing, that drill doesn't do anything for them, because it's not about the drill. It's about what you're focusing on in the drill. And it's about what you understand about what you're trying to do in the drill. because if we just rely on drills, I can tell you exactly what's going to happen is a player is just going to learn what the drill requires. They're going to go out and go through the drill, and after about 2.5 minutes, they're just going to start going through the motions. And they're not going to get anything out of that drill after that first 2.5 minutes because they shut their brain off and they just rely on their body going through the motions, and they don't consciously look for feedback. They don't consciously try to make adjustments from shot to shot to figure out what's going wrong and how do I correct it. They don't understand the concept that they're supposed to be working on. And when I say working on a concept, even if a player doesn't do a technique correctly yet, the drill may allow them to be creative in some ways where they're experimenting with it. They're experimenting with the technique and trying different things with that technique to see what works, what doesn't work, what feels good, what feels bad, and just kind of, the player has to figure it out sometimes on their own. A lot of times the player has to figure it out on their own. And so they need that power and that permission from whether it's a parent coaching them or whether it's a coach coaching them or whether it's them just trying to go out and figure it out on their own. They need that freedom where you're not limiting them to something and they're able to go out and experiment with it a little bit and play with it a little bit. And like we talked about, we want to simplify the information so that they can take that information and go and not have to simplify an action to complete that information. They can take that information and use it in different ways and figure out what works best for me. What do I get results with? What do I feel most comfortable with? And it's kind of like giving them options and then forcing them to make their own decision. And if you think they're making a wrong decision, great, let them know that. But at the same time, you have to give them suggestions. You have to ask them questions that are going to help them step from one path to another path, or go from one conclusion on a decision to another conclusion on a decision. They have to make the decision themselves. You can't make decisions for them. You just have to give them the information in the best way you can possibly give it to them and let them be the ones who figure it out. That goes a lot down the road of the philosophy behind player-led teams and player-led learning, and just striving to get your players to achieve a practice session that's very learning based and very encouraging to open-mindedness and players having that growth mindset. So it has a lot to do with that, and that's how we want to use the drills. Is if from a coaching perspective, if we're having skill development time, sorry about the typo there, I just noticed it. But if you're having skill development time, are we as coaches taking that time that our players are doing drills, they're supposed to work on individual skill? Are we taking that time as a time for us coaches to maybe get together and meet and talk something out and get organized for the next thing we want to do? Or are we actually, are we passively observing? Are we, taking a break? Is that the time when the players are supposed to be working on something, the coach can run and get a drink? No, it is the most important time to be teaching and to be with that player, conversing one-on-one and interacting with them and being the teachers that we're supposed to be as coaches. And from a parent standpoint, if you want to step into the coaching shoes as a parent, that's the time when, again, don't over coach them, don't overstep your bounds, but ask them questions, see what's going through their head, see what they're focused on, find out how they're processing information. Just be careful, don't give them too much information where they start getting frustrated. Make it a conversation. Try to learn about them, because that's, you've probably heard the saying, I can come up with all different kinds of stuff, but one specific example is you've heard it said that players don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. When you take that time that they're supposed to be working on individual skill development and you go spend it one-on-one with them at a basket as they're going through their drills, and you're picking their brain and asking them questions and trying to find out how they feel about something, or whether they're getting the right feedback, and you're striking up that conversation with them, that really shows them how much you care about what's going through their mind, about how successful they're becoming, about how they're progressing and getting better. So that's a very important time when we're going through skill development in our practices. I make sure that that's a time that I can go walk around the gym and the players are focused working on things, and I can address each player individually and try to help them figure out, what's the best route for me, what's the best technique for me, how do I use this to get the most out of my skill development time. And so the whole idea behind this is just go to YouTube or go to one of these coaching help sites and get a ton of drills, because you can get better using any drill out there. It's because it's not about what drill you're using, it's about what you're doing when you're using that drill. What are you focused on? Are you just doing a drill to do a drill, or are you going to pick a certain drill and go, okay, in this drill we're going to focus on getting better with the dip. Now obviously, for you to focus on a drill, for you to use a drill to get better at the dip, it would need to be some kind of drill that involves a player catching a pass and going into a shot. You're not going to do anything off the dribble for dipping, because you don't dip off of a dribble. It's already down there. So there is some specificity when you look at drills in that sense. But you can get better at shooting using any drill. You just got to see what that drill entails so that you can find out, okay, let's work on this technique, this technique, this technique. Let's work on a variety of different techniques, and just one at a time go through them and make sure we're doing these things right. Make sure we're focusing on that specific technique from a mental focus aspect, and making sure these players are keyed in. Like I said, it's what you do in the drill. It's not what the drill has you do. Okay, so that's a way to look at that. Some of the best sessions I've had with players were they made big improvements because they just came into the gym and they would stand there and I would rebound for them, or a parent would rebound for them, and I would stand beside them if a parent's rebounding for them. But we just have conversations, and I just talk to them and pick their brain and ask them questions, and they answer questions to me, and then they may ask me a question in return about something, and I'll give them, my opinion, and then give them maybe some facts to go along with it, or maybe give them some examples of what other players have done that may relate to them. And just having that time to a player's not going through any drills, they're just getting shots up, and they're making sometimes conscious changes to their shot, sometimes unconscious changes to their shot, where we're just standing there shooting, and they've actively made adjustments and found what was most effective for them as a player individually, and they're getting up so many reps by just standing there shooting, that they're building that new habit. They're getting rid of that old habit, and they're building that new habit. And then when they leave, then they can go do as many drills as they want, because they now know what works for them, and they can consciously look for doing the things that we set in that practice session about, here's how I want you to do the turn. You were turning to 11 o'clock, and I think you look much more comfortable when you go to 10:30 or something like that, as an example, where, I've had just huge improvement sometimes with players, and they're not even in a drill, because sometimes you put players in a drill and they're distracted. All they're focused on is doing what the drill wants them to do, and all they're trying to do is get results. And that's not how you're going to improve. You have to focus on the process. And so getting a player to just focus on the process and what's going on in the drill, not necessarily what the drill wants them to do, is how you're going to see those big improvements made in a player's game and in a player's shooting technique. So that pretty much wraps it up for what I wanted to say about it not being about the drill. It's more about what you do in the drill, not about what the drill has you do. For confidence, where does it come from? Where does confidence come from? You asked that, and I think when Dennis Scott was asked that, if you don't know who Dennis Scott is, he played for the Orlando Magic back in the mid '90s with Penny Hardaway and Nick Anderson, Horace Grant, Shaquille O'Neal. He went to the finals and got swept by the Houston Rockets because Nick Anderson decided he was going to miss like 4 free throws in a row. And he's like an 88% free throw shooter, which was just unbelievable. But Dennis Scott was a pretty good 3-point shooter, and he was cornered in an interview one time, and somebody went up to him and said, "Hey, what's the most important part of a player's shot?" And he said, "Confidence." Just like there was nothing else on this earth that he would ever suggest except for just have confidence. And I'm sitting there going, "That's crazy. Like, why would you say that? Like, that doesn't make any sense to me," because it's almost like he's dodging the question, because he doesn't want to give a wrong answer. So he'll give an answer that's just random and off the cuff. And so he says, the most important thing a player needs to have in their jump shot is confidence. And I'm like, okay, that's not really what they were asking there with that question. They're trying to find what's the best thing for a player to improve their jump shot. What's the best thing a player needs to be a good shooter? And that confidence is a result. It's not a process. And that some people just think, some players just have confidence and others don't. Well, why is that? Because some of those players are getting results and others aren't. Okay, so how do we address that? How do we look at it? And how we look at it is a player has to go through the stages of unlearning the bad and relearning the good. So, when we say confidence, it kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier, where, some players don't have confidence because they have anxiety issues. Some players don't have confidence because they can't learn how to handle that feedback that's coming at them. Some players don't have confidence because, a parent isn't letting them have confidence, or a coach isn't letting them have confidence, or their peers, their teammates aren't letting them have confidence. And if you have a player like that, I think it's your duty as a parent or as a coach to try to help figure out to put them in a better position by finding ways that they can focus on the process to get better so that they continue to grow their confidence for the future. So confidence comes from them seeing results. Confidence comes from them seeing the ball go through the hoop time after time after time after time after time. And a player has to go through those stages. It's unavoidable. So as a coach, are you developing lions or are you developing zebras? And what I mean by that is, we had a talk with Coach Mike Jarvis years ago, and I think I've mentioned this on a webinar before. I can't remember exactly which webinar it was, but we had a talk with Mike Jarvis, who used to be the coach at St. John's. Took St. John's to the NCAA tournament. Took a couple other teams to the NCAA tournament. We were down in Florida with him when he was coaching at Florida Atlantic, and he gave a speech on you have to figure out as a coach which of your players are lions and which of your players are zebras. And the lions are obviously the leaders. The zebras are the followers. So if you have a player that's a zebra, are they going to have a lot of confidence? Probably not. Okay. But if you have players that are lions, you find those lions, and those are the players that are going to have confidence. Those are the players that you can have more of a mentor relationship with, where you're not giving them commands, you're asking them questions. Because those are your leaders. Those are the ones that are going to take over and lead for you when you can't be out there on the court with your players during a game or during a scrimmage, or even sometimes in practice when you just turn it over to the players and let them figure it out on their own, which is actually a pretty good strategy. But don't let it get too out of hand. You got to rein them in sometimes. But you have to figure out, are the players you're coaching, which ones are lions, which ones are zebras? Okay? Zebras, you have to find a way to give them confidence. Lions are going to have that natural confidence. Okay? But it's a result of what they've already done. Okay? So you have to push them and mentor them to keep pushing themselves so that they're getting better and better results and their confidence continues to grow. The zebras, they're going to grow a little bit of confidence from those lions because those lions are leaders. And if they are good enough lions and good enough leaders, they're going to take those zebras and they're going to pull them along with them. But it's also the job of parents and coaches and whoever's around the team a lot to make sure that those zebras are living up to the standard of the lions. Because otherwise, I mean, you know how it goes in nature. If a lion sees a weak zebra, he's going to pick them off and eat them. Okay? So we have to make sure that our zebras are staying strong as well. You have to increase their confidence and encourage their growth and get them to focus on the process so that they can grow as well and keep up with those lions. Because if they don't keep up with those lions, that's when you get things like bullying and all this other stuff, because your lions are going to turn around to look at their zebras and make sure their zebras are marching right behind them. And if they see one that's straggling, they don't want anything to hold them back, so they're going to go back and they're going to eat that zebra. All right, that's a little visual for you there. So from a standpoint of no matter what level you're on, are you instilling confidence in your players, or are you limiting them in their abilities? And that goes back to, you know, what we talked about the first week. We said you have to simplify the information, don't simplify the actions. When you simplify actions, I talked about that's limiting a player. It's causing a player to feel like they're under some sort of restriction. And that's not how you instill confidence in players. You can't place restrictions on them. You can't, and I understand that there are coaches out there that say, well, you know, I have a kid who likes to shoot threes, but he's not a good three-point shooter at all. How would you address that? So I'm asking myself a question here. Well, how I would address that is, first of all, privately, you know, pull the kid in and say, hey, have you ever noticed that you're shooting a very low percentage on your threes? You know, and I notice you like to shoot threes, so let's figure out a way to make you better at it so that you can go out there and shoot threes and enjoy playing this game. And so address it privately first and be able to get the player know that their performance is subpar, but that you want to help them get better so that they can help the team. You want to help them get better because you care about them. And so you have to start then making sure that, like I said, you're coaching them from a standpoint of you are giving them information and you are simplifying that information so that they can take that information and do what they need to do with it, not limiting their actions or not simplifying actions in a way that they feel restricted. For instance, like, oh, coach doesn't believe in me. You know, you can't just call that player out in front of all of his peers and say, hey, you're horrible from the freaking three-point line. You better not ever shoot another shot from the three-point line this year. Like, that's the exact wrong way to address that, because that right there entails the lion eating the zebra right away. So we can't do that. You have to address it, you know, privately, individually, and just be encouraging about it. Like, you know, at first there are times to get negative. I believe I'm not 100%. Oh, you always got to be positive, but I'm also not 100%. Oh, you always got to be negative. You need a good balance between the two. Don't feel like you need to be more one or more the other. You need a good balance between the two. And there are times when one works better than another. I think sometimes if you know, for those lions, let me give an example of you know, sometime when you would use negative tactics and maybe call a player out in front of their peers is, you know, maybe you have a lion or a baby lion, if you will. You know, maybe you have some player that you're trying to develop into a better leader, and you have, you know, one or two other leaders on your team, and this kid has the potential to be a really good third leader, and maybe his confidence has gotten to be arrogance. Okay, so how do you take that arrogance and pull it back down? Because arrogance is just overconfidence. Arrogance is just they get to a point where they're ignoring the feedback and they just think that they're, you know, something that they're not. And so you have to use tactics to knock that arrogance down to where they're no longer arrogant, they're now confident. All right. So I see it as kind of a tower, kind of a scale. And, sometimes you need to knock that arrogance out and bring them down to where they're just confident. And then make sure that when you go to build them back up, and you need to do that soon after you knock them down, go build that confidence back up, but don't let it get to the point where it's going to be arrogance again. And a way to do that is just, if you got a player who's arrogant, like if they make an obvious mistake and they know they made a mistake and all their peers make a mistake, like call them out really quick about it and then give them a solution and help them with that solution, and show the zebras, you're not just going to go out and spade a lion in front of all the zebras, because then all the zebras are going to make fun of that lion. Go to that kid and knock them down a few rings, and then purposely in front of everybody, zebras and all the other lions and everything, go to that kid and work with them individually on getting back to where you want them, and showing them where you want them, and coaching them in a way that you're putting confidence back in them, but also challenging them to meet a certain standard. And that when they get arrogant, they're completely ignoring that standard and they're doing their own thing. And that's not what we want to do. That's not what we want to do at all. So are you instilling confidence in your players? Are you limiting them in their abilities? We want to be a coach who instills confidence. We want to be a coach who's not limiting them in their abilities. We're simplifying information and allowing them to take that and do their thing with it. Not a coach who's limiting or simplifying their actions and limiting them as a player and making them feel like, oh, I can't accomplish this. Okay? So with that, I'll take us off screen share here and go to any questions you guys have. That was the main little subject speech that I have for today as far as those two subjects. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to type in the Q&A, or you can always go to the raise your hand button if you want to jump in and have a conversation. We'll do a conversation. You guys can raise your hand and I'll bring you in, and we'll unmute your mic on my end and have a conversation about it. I enjoyed that speech or that little conversation that we had with Mike Jarvis about the lions and the zebras. He kind of explained it as a triangle, as a pyramid, or an upside down pyramid, and talked about three basic classifications of information and how you want to address the lions versus how you want to address the zebras. And we went outside. We were outside when he was talking about it. He had a permanent marker, and he actually drew on the side of the building in permanent marker the little illustration of the pyramids and showing the different levels of information. And one of them was he would draw a pyramid, and he would have an upright pyramid where the peak was at the top and the wide base was at the bottom. And he said, for your leaders, I'll see if I get this right without having it right in front of me to reference in my notes. He said for your leaders, your leaders, and there were three sections. There were commands, there were questions, and there was mentorship. And mentorship is just being able to connect with the players, sitting down with them, and just having conversation with them, and being able to, not necessarily be their friend, but mentor them and ask them questions to lead them and get them to think in a way beyond them just answering your question, but changing their mindset completely. And so the commands is at the top, and the mentorship is at the bottom. And so for that upright pyramid where the peak is at the top, they need just a little bit of those commands, and they need a lot of mentorship. That's your lions, because it just teaches them to be better leaders. Leaders don't need commands. Leaders, you're very quick with your commands. You're very decisive with your commands, and then you give nothing else, because then the leaders have to take those commands and go with them. Your zebras, it's an upside down pyramid. Okay, so it's an upside down pyramid where the peak is at the bottom. So your zebras, those followers, they need very little. They need very little mentorship, and they need more commands because they're followers. They're going to do exactly what you tell them to do. Those lions, you have to have confidence in them that they can be good leaders and figure it out on their own and actually lead their players, their teammates, by the little instructions that you've given them. I got a couple questions here we'll go to. How do you handle a coach as a parent when a coach is trying to teach the beef method and you have your child player working on the pro shot method? This is tricky. I usually tell parents to try to stay out of it at first and encourage the player to strike up conversation with their coach. Encourage the player to converse these issues with their coach, and make it more player-led. You know, if there's an issue between a coach and a player, you need to first see if that issue can be handled between the coach and the player. And so I would say at first, as a parent, don't get involved. You know, don't get involved to a point where you encourage your child to communicate with their coach and let them know what's going on. Tell the child, you know, make sure the child understands the different aspects of pro shot and how to work through those. And you know, the unfortunate thing is that there are a lot of coaches out there that are closed-minded. And the second your child goes to them and tells them, I'm working on pro shot, not you know, whatever you're trying to teach me, unfortunately, they get negative immediately if they know what pro shot is. Unfortunately, they get negative immediately if it conflicts with their direct views on it. So you have to encourage the player to be the one that's communicating with the coach and telling them, this is what I'm doing, this is why I'm doing it. And if you give your player, you know, solid information, if they understand the information solidly enough that that they can explain it to the coach, I'm not saying you're going to change any coaches' minds, but you may have a coach that's open-minded enough, or you hope you have a coach that's open-minded enough that can take a step back and go, wow, this player seems to really understand what they're doing with their shot here. You know, maybe I ought to leave them alone. Maybe I ought to let them do their own thing. That's what we hope, but doesn't always happen. So I always tell my players, here's what I tell my players, because I think parents' involvement between a coach and a player issue should be minimal, just as minimal as possible, and encourage the player to stand up for themselves, encourage the player to communicate for themselves with that coach and let that coach know what's going on. You know, to teach them to grow up, teach them to be more responsible for themselves, and they're only going to be better for it in the long run. But this is what I tell my players. I tell my players, you have choice. And what I want you to do is when your coach tells you to do something that is against what you know you should do, that we teach, and you've been working on and you see it works, tell your coach what you're doing, why you're doing it, and that you don't even need to bring up pro shot. You don't even need to bring up our name. Just have a conversation with the coach and say, hey coach, this is what I'm doing and this is why I'm doing it. And don't say, coach, I use this release because this is Kobe Bryant's release. That's the exact approach you don't want to take, because that a coach then immediately shuts it off and goes, well, you're not Kobe Bryant. And they come up with some kind of flawed logic like that. What you need to do is tell them, hey coach, I use this thing, just release is simple. So I'll use it as an example. Hey coach, when I shoot 4 fingers down like this, I have trouble keeping my shot consistent. It likes to come off different fingers every time. So what I'm doing is I'm doing this index finger release so that the ball comes off the same finger every time. And I'm just trying to put that index finger right in the middle of the rim to make sure that my shot stays straight. And if you got a coach that knows what they're doing, that coach's eyes are going to open wide and that coach's jaw is going to drop when a player says that, because they look very, very educated on what they're doing, and they look very, very very intelligent as to the approach they're taking. So I always try to make the player be the one that looks good, make the player be the one that's communicating the information, and tell the player, look, just communicate with your coach honestly and openly about what you're doing and why you're doing it. And I said, if after that they still don't agree with you, then you have to make a conscious decision. Are you going to accept their coaching, or are you going to do what you know is right? Or what you know gets success, or what you know feels good. And that's where the player has to make this decision. What am I going to do? And I know that's a really hard decision to make. But like I said, the player needs to be responsible. And it's our job as parents just to encourage them to accept that responsibility and make the decision that they know is right. And just tell them, encourage them, hey, you got to make the decision that you know is right. And then I tell my players, if a coach just keeps trying to correct you or keeps belittling you because of it, because I've seen it happen. It's a sad thing, but I've seen it happen where coaches just they will outright bully players because the player chooses to not do what they want the player to do. And those are the exact kinds of tactics that we're trying to avoid by having these webinars. Is education is never a bad thing. So the player went to the coach, they tried to educate the coach on what it is they were trying to do. So now the player needs to take it into their own hands. That I always tell them, then your second option is, when that coach starts to be like that, you gotta learn to turn them off. You gotta learn to ignore people, because later in life you're going to get into a situation where someone is not going to agree with you, and that doesn't necessarily give you the permission to act like they act. So be the bigger person. Learn to shut them off and ignore them. And when they give you coaching, just smile, nod your head, say, okay, coach, and then make it look like you're trying to do something, but do what you know works, and do what you know is right. That's the best really answer that I can give for that. Is just instill confidence in your player again, and give them that opportunity to be responsible and to strike up that conversation with the coach and be personable with them. And I know they're going to come back to you as the parent if they're discouraged, or if the coach comes after them for it. I've seen it happen. And I would say, as a parent, try to at all occasions try to avoid that confrontation with the coach. Try to go to somebody else first. Try to go to maybe an assistant first. And there's a hierarchy in coaching for a reason. So say there's 3 assistants and 1 head coach, and one of the assistants supports what your kid's trying to do, and maybe the head coach isn't supporting it. Have a conversation with someone is going to possibly be on your side first, and then just work your way up from there. But try to avoid those situations if at all possible, and instill more confidence and responsibility in your child and your player, to show them that you believe they can be the solution to the problem, and that you don't always have to step in and do things for them. So I hope that helps. How do you handle a parent that continually tries to undo everything you teach their kid about their shot because they still believe in the beef method? Well, first of all, you can explain to them, David, that we do not conflict with beef as it's originally taught. We do conflict with beef from the standpoint of what a lot of parents believe beef is, because they were taught wrong. If you go back and watch George Lehman's videos, everything that we teach is in direct agreement and direct concordance with how beef was taught. Because when you square up, that's not balance. When you talk about the elbow, that's an effect, not a cause. So we're addressing things that George Lehman talked about in his videos that he didn't really describe very well in beef. And beef is a very vague, general instructional point, where what we decided to do with Forrest is go deeper than beef and be more specific in our instruction and try to find words that specifically describe the actions and the techniques that we're trying to do versus just kind of threw something out there because it sounded good, and now you got to do a lot of explaining behind it. Those are not effective ways to do that. So ultimately, as a coach, I would say you're not the number one responsibility for a player. The parent is the number one responsibility for a player. And if you think about this philosophically, this does not conflict with anything I said before. What you need to do is you need to have the conversation not with the parent, but with the player, and let the player look. Just be honest with them. Tell them, look, I teach this because A, B, and C. Give them the why. Give them the how. And then tell them, like, what you're trying to do is not necessarily wrong, but what you're trying to do is much harder and going to make it more difficult for you to succeed because of A, B, and C. And if they can't understand that, your responsibility as a coach is to plant the seed. Your responsibility as a coach is not to make sure that plant grows. If it's a bad seed, it just doesn't grow. So that's an approach I would take. Your responsibility as a coach is to plant the seed. You are responsible for their success, but if they choose to fail on their own, that is their choice. All you can do is be encouraging and give honest information and tell them exactly why you're teaching what you are teaching, and explain it to them in the best way you possibly can. And if they want to ignore it, that's their choice. And it's unfortunate, but that's just the way it goes. So I hope that helps, Dave. I think Dave, you have my number, so if you want to give me a call, guys, any of you guys that have my number, if you want to give me a call, I'm usually up until like 2 or 3 a.m. So feel free to call me and ask me any additional things to the question. Next one says, my biggest challenge in teaching shooting is when a kid simply cannot duplicate the basics of 90-degree elbow, knee bend, follow through with ball coming off fingertips, thus creating perfect backspin rotation, etc. What techniques do you use in that situation? What I would try to do is I don't try to get them to, let me see how I want to word this exactly. I don't try to get them to necessarily duplicate and fall to form, because to me, that's starting to get into that realm where you're limiting the action. What I do is I try to communicate the information in a way that I'm giving them the goal, I'm giving them the process and how it happens. And then what I would do is I would try to give them different suggestions, okay? Because there's not just one way to do this. So I would come up with like 3 different options for them. For each technique you teach them, come up with like 3 different options for them, because that's not limiting the action. That's giving them options on the action. And try those 3 different, have them try those 3 different options and see which one they like best. From a standpoint of let me just use the finger as an example again. So we teach this index finger release where you come down like this and you kind of have a pinch. What if a player doesn't want to do this specifically? That's fine. You can also teach them to do this, where they don't pitch, where they just come through like this, and teach them to follow through in this regard or this method. The other thing you could do is just teach them to, hold that finger maybe a little bit lower than the other ones, and make sure that index finger is in line with the middle of the basket. So there are different ways to complete an action effectively and efficiently. You don't have to limit to just one precise way. Give them similar yet different options, maybe 2, 3, 4 different options. Don't give them too much, because then their brains will explode, and we don't want to clean up that mess. But just give them 2, 3, 4 different options of maybe slight variations to what it is you want them to do, and then just try to get them to figure out which one of those is most comfortable. And I always do this when I'm trying to convince a player of what changes to make. I always go to our question, how do you miss? And I talk about how do you miss because that gets much more specific in their mind from a feedback standpoint. And that they're then thinking, okay, how do I miss is if I'm trying to address maybe a technique that helps them with short and long misses, but a player is missing right, then I can see where I may have had a misconception. Or ask a player sometimes, how do you miss? And if you know that they're missing short, and they say, well, I'm missing left, then you can show them like, okay, hey, go ahead and shoot, and let's see. And then they shoot, and they're short, and then they shoot, and they're short, and then they shoot, and you're short, and you're like, hey, you were short 3 times in a row. What do you mean you missed left? Like, then teach them, like, this is left, this is right, this is short, this is long. I went into a gym with a player one time, and before I even tried to change anything, like, I saw that the player didn't even understand what direction they were missing. I went in, and this was a college basketball player. I walked in the gym with him. We were getting ready to do a workout. This is the first time he'd ever been with me. He started shooting, and I just tried to kind of get an idea of where his shot was, what we wanted to change. And so I stopped him after he shot about 20 shots. And he made his first shot, and he missed his next 19. He was not a very good shooter, but he was a pretty good defender. He was exciting to watch, but he was fairly athletic. But he was just a horrible shooter. He was by far the worst shooter on the college team. So that's why the coach sent him to me. And so this kid just starts shooting, and I stop him, and I go, hey, Trey. That's not his real name. I'm just making this up. It's similar to his real name, but it's not his real name. I said, hey, Trey. How did you miss those shots? Like, you've missed 19 in a row now. How did you miss those shots? What direction? And he goes, I missed short. And I said, Trey, you just missed the last 17 straight shots to the right. They weren't short. They were actually more long than they were short. And like, I had to understand that he doesn't even see where he's missing. So we've got bigger problems here than I probably thought we had in the first place. He's got a total disconnect with his feedback. So the first thing I had to teach him before we even address technique is how to assess, how to gain feedback, how to get the information that he needs to make adjustments back in his shot. And just by doing that, I mean, he improved by 10 times, which when you're only making 1 out of 20, 10 times is, you're still not that good. But just, having variations and understanding how a player sees what they're doing and what kind of feedback they're getting a lot of times will help you figure out how to avoid those roadblocks where a player just can't seem to get something down. So I hope that helps. That's typically a strategy that I use for those types of situations. Next one. Oh, you asked again, are repetitions the only answer? I will say this. Chris Mullen, I believe it is, had a really good quote one time. He said, you as a player can go out and you can shoot 500 shots a day efficiently and be a great shooter, or you can go out and you can shoot 2,500 shots a day inefficiently and be a great shooter. So can the players still become great by having flaws and bad technique in their form? Yes, but it takes them way longer to get there. The repetitions are just exponentially more. Um, so let me kind of present this to you. Is are repetitions the only answer? No. And here's what I mean by that. Don't think that you just need to have your player go through repetition after repetition after repetition after repetition after repetition, and it's eventually going to happen. There's a few different factors that we can go into here, and I don't want to get real deep into them because it'll take forever. Sometimes you have to figure out whether a player is, and there's a guy on here that we were talking right before we started, named Derek, about upper body versus lower body. And some players have good coordination in their upper body. Some players have good coordination in their lower body. If you try to teach a player to do something with their upper body and they are lower body coordinated, they are not going to be able to do anything you ask them to do because they just don't have the coordination. They don't have the mental neural connections, the strong mental neural connections and carrying capacity through their neurons to get that message effectively to that part of their body, which is why they don't have coordination. So what you have to do is find alternative ways to teach them how to use one area of their body by coaching a different part of their body. And that kind of relates with the discussion we had in the first week where we talked about cause and effect. Sometimes effects happen that are caused by something somewhere else in the body. And so we need to understand the relationships that some parts of our body have with other parts of our body, because if we want to manipulate one part of their body that the player doesn't have any control over because they don't have good, strong neural connections there, then we can actually build better technique by coaching another part of the body. If you need a specific example of that, let me do this for all you guys. I'm going to the chat. If you guys want to bring up chat. My cell phone number is in chat. So if you need any further information tonight, up until like 2 a.m., so that's 6 hours from now, for the next 6 hours, if you have any further information that you want or further questions that you want to ask beyond what you've asked in here, because I could keep going more and more and more on that answer and talking about all the other routes that we have beside repetitions, but it would literally take me like 3 or 4 more webinars to cover all that information. So we can at least get into a basis of that if you want to give me a call or shoot me a text. If you're not in the US, I have what's called WhatsApp. It's an app on the phone, and you can text and call over internet connection through either voice or video over WhatsApp. So that's an easy way to get a hold of me if you have any questions or anything like that. So I hope that helps. No, repetitions are not the only answer. I would also suggest maybe trying to teach it differently. I think it is our primary responsibility to get a player to understand the information and be able to change on their own. And to do that, sometimes the words we're using maybe just aren't effective or aren't creating a light bulb in their mind. So we need to find different examples of how to explain it. We need to find different ways or methods in how to explain these techniques so that we can get the player to wrap their brain around the concept and understand it in a way that they can use it and be effective with it. So I hope that helps. My phone number is below. If you had any more information about that this evening, give me a call. And if I don't answer right away, I'll call you right back. So Jim asks, is there any is there any value in one hand shooting, form shooting in the pro shot system? Yes, but not a lot. If you do too much of it, it can make a player very mechanical and rigid in their movements. And what I mean by that is it starts to create a habit where the brain starts to send a message to the shooting hand and arm, but it doesn't send a message to the offhand and arm to work with the shooting hand and arm. So when I have my players going through form shooting, I always try to get them to do two-handed form shooting, not one-handed form shooting, and just take 5 shots to address one hand and then take 5 other shots to address the other hand, and just kind of make it so that they're only focused on one little thing at a time, but you're not completely limiting the action and changing the motion of another part of the body because you're focused on one part of the body. I hope that kind of helps and makes sense. I don't encourage a lot of one-hand form shooting. Maybe a little bit for some younger players, or maybe a little bit for some players that are having issues, just to figure out what's going on and what changes can we make, and where is the cause of these certain things coming from. I don't always need one-hand form shooting to figure that out. My background's in exercise physiology, and I've studied a lot of biomechanics and kinematics, and looked at bodily movements, and I studied to get specific movements down. I did a lot of studying of golf swings when I was in college, and so you can see certain movements in the body and where their cause comes from. And so I can see that a lot of times in the movement, and I have a couple things that I have players do just during their shot to kind of make those kind of jump out at me. Sometimes introducing things like extra rhythm in their shot or extra movement in their shot, just to see how they handle it, can sometimes make those movements jump out at me, and make me see where things are going wrong, or where we're having a difficulty in transition from one movement to the next. So that's kind of a vague general answer. But there is some value in it, especially if you look at Pete Newell, which is the coaching tree I'm a lot more familiar with. Even though I'm from Ohio, you would think I'm a Bob Knight coaching tree guy. But I'm more familiar with the Pete Newell coaching tree. I know a lot more coaches in Pete Newell's coaching tree, and am more familiar with a lot of his philosophies. And he uses this thing called whole part whole teaching, where you start with the whole picture, you break it down into its components, and build those components back into a whole, so that they can easily see the movement, break the movement down, and then build the movement back up into its final piece. And so, does form shooting hold any value? Yes, but you have to not just get focused on one part of that form shooting. You've got to be able to do multiple things and focus on multiple areas in that form shooting. So I would say when you're doing form shooting, don't throw out those other components. Just have them focus on one aspect of their form. They can still do form shooting with 2 hands, but they're only focused on one part of their form. So I hope that helps and that makes sense a little bit. Again, phone number's down there if you want to discuss it further. I'm just going to try to wrap this up so people can get out of here. Steve asked, do you find that left-handers are naturally more turned on their shot than right-handers? Absolutely. Yes, they are. I don't think I've ever once met a lefty that squares up. Never seen it. Because, and the only way I can find to explain that is right-handers are left-brained, left-handers are right-brained. Right brain is more of a creative type mind. So there typically you see differences in people who are right-handed and people who are left-handed. And I'm not just talking about what hand they write with or what foot they kick with. I'm talking about the way they think, the way they process things. Our one side of our brain is more towards analytics and numbers and logic, and the other side of our brain is more towards artistry and creativity and stuff like that. So left-handed people tend to have, now my wife is a definite exception to this. Don't tell her I'm saying this because she's just upstairs, but typically left-handed people are much more creative, except for my wife. She is not. She is very, very analytical. She focuses a lot on numbers. So she is an anomaly, which is why I married her, I guess. But yes, left-handers are much more natural turners than right-handers, and I think a lot of that just comes from the fact that they use a different part of their brain to control their body. They're more right brain dominant, typically, if they are left-handed players, and that right brain dominant gives them more leniency towards creativeness and just that creative side and almost fantasy side of brain function. That's the best way I could probably put it. So yeah, lefties. I mean, you can't get them to square up. It's almost impossible for a lefty to square up. My wife, of course, when she shoots, I almost vomit when she does it, but she does turn naturally. So, Pat asks, any simple tip on how to sway properly? I will give you one command, and this will help you with both the turn and the sway. When your player shoots, finish with the shooting shoulder in front of their chin. In other words, when they're shooting, just get them to start, because sway is all on the shoulders. If you start addressing their feet during the sway, they're going to start kicking their feet. They're going to be off balance. They're going to lose control. A lot of things are going to happen that are bad for them if you focus on the feet, because the feet are an effect. We want to focus on the cause, and the cause primarily of the sway is the shoulders and how the shoulders are positioned. We want something called slope in the shoulders, which means your dominant shoulder is high, your non-dominant shoulder is slightly down and relaxed. That creates a slope in the shoulders. So your front shoulder's high, your back shoulder's low. Okay? And that slope in the shoulder is what gives a player their ability to sway in their shot. Okay? Now, if you have a player that doesn't jump high when they shoot, you're not going to see a whole lot of sway because they're not off the ground enough to give them time to come forward. That is one thing that you should be conscious of. However, to sway properly, finish shoulder in front of the chin. And the way you do that is you can start wherever they want to start, whatever's comfortable to them. I think the starting point of the turn is more of an artistic thing. My whole point is just don't square up, have the shoulders a little bit unequal to the basket. That way they get a good starting sense of, okay, I'm shooting with this side indefinitely. So then I say, finish with the shoulder in front of the chin. So they're just going to come up and shoot, and they want to finish here. My shoulder's out in front. My shooting shoulder is out in front of my chin. It's not touching my chin, so when I shoot, it's out here in front. You don't see it touching my chin. It may look like it's touching my chin from this angle, but it's out in front of me. My shoulder gets in front of my chin. And if you have players that are able to get here, it'll get the turn and it'll get them to sway, and everything else should happen automatically. Everything else is just an effect of that movement. So I hope that helps. Got that one. So I got through all my Q&As. I don't see anything else in chat, and I don't see any hands raised. If you guys want to chat about anything else, let me know. Or also, phone number is there in the chat panel. Write that down anytime you need it. Feel free to call me. Or if you're out of country, WhatsApp me and text me or video call me or whatever you got to do through WhatsApp over the internet, and we'll have a conversation. But that's about all I got for this week. Guys, again, have a great Mother's Day. If you haven't already, call your mothers and wish them happy Mother's Day. And we'll connect again. Again, email for part 4 for next Sunday will go out tomorrow morning at about 10 a.m. Eastern time. So be waiting for that if you want to participate in that next week. And I will see you guys then. Thanks a lot.